Get ready, because today morning something shifts with startling speed. This is not the kind of change that slowly announces itself, gives you time to adjust, and gently becomes noticeable over the following days. It is more like a bone, suddenly being set back into its proper position after you have spent weeks walking around with a fracture you never realized was there. Mercury, the planet associated with the way you process information, organize your thoughts, communicate with others, and make decisions, enters Virgo today. And when that happens, the mental haze that has surrounded you does not simply begin fading at some vague point in the future. It can feel as though the fog is pulled away almost immediately, revealing something that was sitting in front of you all along. But there is a deeper reason this particular transition matters so much. Mercury is not merely moving into another sign. Mercury is returning to a place where its influence is exceptionally strong. Virgo is the one sign of the zodiac where Mercury holds absolute authority as its ruler, and it is also the sign where Mercury is exalted. There is no other sign where Mercury is considered more powerful. That distinction changes the entire atmosphere of this transition. Over the next 72 hours, that heightened Mercury energy can bring 3 areas of your life into such sharp focus that avoiding them becomes nearly impossible. Things you have questioned, rationalized, postponed, or tried to interpret from every possible angle may suddenly become impossible to deny. The endless guessing begins to lose its grip. The mental loops start breaking apart. In their place comes something much more direct, a form of certainty that may feel almost uncomfortable, because once you truly see something, you cannot return to pretending that you do not. And there is another detail you should not dismiss. If your body has recently been reacting in unusual ways, especially through sudden nausea, digestive disturbances, or unexplained tension around your stomach, stay with me. Because there is a specific reason this may feel connected to everything happening internally right now, and I will come back to that later. First, however, you need to understand the period you just lived through, because without that context, you may underestimate how significant today really is. What has been developing behind the scenes is much larger than the confusion itself suggested. The disorder you experienced was not meaningless. There was a larger astrological sequence unfolding beneath it. Think back over the last couple of weeks. If your mind has felt as though it were being pulled in several directions at once, if you have replayed situations until you could no longer tell what actually happened from what you imagined might happen, there is a reason this period felt so mentally exhausting. On August 12th, a total solar eclipse occurred in Leo. This was not a partial eclipse or a quiet energetic adjustment. It was a total solar eclipse, and it occurred on the South Node, symbolically, that places the emphasis on release. Old identities, familiar patterns, outdated ways of living, and stories you have carried about, who you are and what you deserve. Instead of simply handing you something new, the eclipse was connected with dismantling what had already become too small, too familiar, or too disconnected from the person you are becoming. It did not wait for you to feel ready. It exposed the structures that were already weakening and forced you to look at what remained after they began to fall apart. Since that day, part of you has been trying to understand the debris. You have been searching for an explanation for why certain feelings became louder, why certain conversations remained stuck in your head, and why situations that once seemed manageable suddenly felt disproportionately important. Yet there was a reason. Clarity remained difficult. Mercury was still in Leo. Mercury in Leo can process experience through expression, emotion, performance, pride, and personal meaning. And during this period, your mind may have become less interested in finding a clean answer and more consumed with replaying the emotional story. You may have reconstructed conversations that never actually happened. You may have taken one sentence from someone and examined it from every possible direction, searching for a hidden message that might not even have been there. You may have imagined the worst possible outcome. Then experience that imagined outcome emotionally, as though it were already real. This is where the exhaustion becomes especially intense, because anxiety can begin wearing the mask of intuition. A worried thought can feel like a warning. A fear can feel like a prediction. A passing emotion can suddenly appear to carry enormous significance. Everything may have felt urgent, personal, and connected to some much larger question about your life. Mercury, moving through the final exhausted degrees of Leo, was operating in an atmosphere of overstimulation, emotional repetition, and mental fatigue. Your mind was not necessarily failing to find answers, because you were incapable of understanding what was happening. You may simply have been trying to solve a problem with the wrong mental instrument. That is why today matters. The version of your thinking that has kept circling the same questions begins to lose its dominance, and what replaces it may feel so different that you immediately recognize the contrast. Mercury changes signs roughly every 3 weeks, so technically, Mercury moving from one sign into another is not an extraordinary event by itself. These transitions happen regularly, and many people move through them without consciously noticing much difference. But this particular shift carries another layer of significance. When Mercury enters Virgo, Mercury is not entering unfamiliar territory. Mercury is entering its own domain. Virgo expresses qualities such as precision, observation, analysis, pattern recognition, organization, discrimination, and the ability to identify what is useful and separate it from what is unnecessary. These qualities are deeply connected with Mercury itself. In this environment, Mercury has access to the very tools it governs. It can examine details instead of becoming lost inside them. It can compare facts instead of feeding assumptions. It can recognize patterns without immediately turning every pattern into a catastrophe. Most importantly, Mercury in Virgo can help transform scattered mental energy into something usable. That is why the change can feel less like receiving new information and more like, finally, being able to understand information you already had. The pieces may have been present for weeks, but you could not arrange them correctly while your mind was overwhelmed by emotional noise. Today, the noise begins to separate from the signal. And there is an even more important distinction that makes this transition stand apart from an ordinary sign change. Virgo is not only ruled by Mercury. Virgo is also the sign where Mercury reaches exaltation. That means Mercury is not merely at home here. In traditional astrology, this is a position of elevated strength, a place where the planet can express its qualities with exceptional effectiveness. So what you are approaching is not simply another chapter in the transit. It is a change in the quality of your perception itself. And that is where the next part of this story begins. Across the entire zodiac, there is only one planetary placement, where a planet holds both rulership and exaltation at the same time. And that unique placement is Mercury in Virgo. Think of the distinction this way. When a planet is in its own sign, it is operating within territory that belongs to it, a place where its nature is understood, supported, and able to function without constantly fighting against its surroundings. Rulership gives Mercury the feeling of being in its own house, surrounded by its own tools, able to move according to its natural instincts without needing permission. Exaltation takes that strength even higher. It describes a condition in which the planet is elevated, honored, and capable of expressing its qualities at an exceptionally high level. Today, Mercury carries both forms of traditional dignity at once. Historical astrologers recognize the unusual strength of this placement, and figures such as Al-Biruni documented planetary dignities, while William Lilly recorded these principles in his tables. Under the traditional scoring system, rulership contributes 5 points and exaltation contributes 4, producing a combined dignity score of 9. Within that traditional framework, that is the highest combined score a planet can receive. So this is not simply Mercury functioning comfortably. It is Mercury operating at maximum traditional strength. And the reason that matters for you is that Mercury governs the very processes you have been struggling with: thinking, interpreting, communicating, sorting information, connecting facts, and deciding what something actually means. When Mercury functions with extraordinary strength in Virgo, the emphasis turns toward precision. What has been tangled can begin separating. What has been vague can become specific. What has been surrounded by assumptions can be examined for what is actually true. You may suddenly recognize that some of the stories you have been repeating to yourself were never supported by the evidence you actually had. You may see that a situation you have been analyzing from 10 different angles only seemed complicated because emotion kept covering the simplest explanation. Decisions that have consumed enormous amounts of mental energy can suddenly appear much easier to understand. It can feel as though an answer arrived out of nowhere, when in reality the information was already there, and you simply could not see it clearly through the emotional atmosphere surrounding Mercury in Leo. And this brings us back to something I mentioned earlier, because your body may have been participating in this story in ways you did not fully understand. Think about the recent physical sensations you have experienced: the unexplained tightness around your stomach, digestive discomfort, nausea, bloating, or that strange, unsettled feeling that appeared even when there was no obvious external reason for it. Within traditional astrology, Virgo is associated with the digestive system, particularly the intestines and the body's process of sorting what can be absorbed from what needs to be eliminated. Mercury, meanwhile, is traditionally connected with the nervous system and the transmission of signals throughout the body. Put those symbolic associations together, and the connection becomes especially interesting. The gut and brain communicate constantly, and modern understanding of the gut-brain connection has made the relationship between emotional states and digestive sensations much easier to recognize. When your mind has been overloaded, when you have been caught in repetitive thoughts, when Mercury has been moving through the final degrees of Leo while you are also processing the aftermath of the eclipse, your body can reflect that internal strain. The stomach can tighten. Digestion can become uncomfortable. Your body can remain tense even when nothing obvious is happening around you. You may feel anxious in your abdomen before you can even explain what you are anxious about. From the symbolic perspective of this transit, your body was not simply creating random discomfort. It was expressing something your conscious mind had difficulty putting into words. The internal confusion was being translated into physical sensation. Your body was communicating through the language of tension because your mind had not yet found the language of clarity. But today, when Mercury enters Virgo, that relationship begins to change. The mental system that has been overwhelmed starts moving toward organization. The feedback between your internal state and your physical sensations may begin to feel different. This does not mean every physical problem suddenly disappears, and it does not mean that astrology replaces medical explanations for symptoms. Rather, within the symbolic framework of this transit, greater mental organization can coincide with a noticeable sense of physical release. Some of you may feel your stomach soften. Your breathing may become deeper without you consciously trying to make it happen. You may notice that the constant internal pressure has eased slightly, as though something that has been clenched inside you finally loosened. The sensation can be surprisingly immediate because you are not necessarily receiving new circumstances. You are responding differently to the circumstances that already exist. Your mind begins sending a different signal, and your body may respond to that change in perception. This is where the first major revelation begins. The first thing Mercury in Virgo may help you recognize is the wound itself. Within hours of Mercury entering Virgo at 3 o'clock today afternoon, Mercury forms an exact trine with Chiron. That timing matters because Chiron represents the deepest wound in the astrological story, the place where pain can remain present for years while gradually becoming intertwined with identity. Chiron is often associated with the wound that does not simply disappear, but instead becomes connected with wisdom through the process of living with it, understanding it, and eventually seeing what it has taught you. There is something especially powerful about discovering a wound you have carried for so long that you stop recognizing it as a wound at all. You adapted to it. You built routines around it. You developed reactions that seemed like personality traits. You created defenses so familiar that you forgot they were defenses. Eventually, the pain becomes background noise, something you hear constantly but no longer consciously notice. You may have told yourself that you are simply cautious, independent, sensitive, demanding, detached, or difficult to trust. Yet sometimes those characteristics are not the original truth. Sometimes they are the architecture built around an old injury. And when Mercury, the planet of observation and understanding, forms a trine with Chiron, the potential exists for you to finally look directly at something you have spent years avoiding without being overwhelmed by it. You do not necessarily have to relive the entire story. You may simply recognize the pattern. You may suddenly understand why a particular situation affects you so intensely, why certain words trigger a disproportionate reaction, or why you keep returning to the same emotional dynamic, even after promising yourself that you were finished with it. The revelation may not arrive as a dramatic external event. It may be quieter and more powerful than that. It may be the moment when you realize that the pain has been influencing your choices from behind the curtain. And once you can finally see the wound clearly, the next question becomes impossible to avoid. What has that wound been controlling in your life without you realizing it? Today, something changes in the way you understand the wound itself. Mercury's exceptionally sharp analytical quality locks into a harmonious Earth trine with Chiron from Virgo to Taurus. And instead of simply experiencing an old pain, you may suddenly become capable of observing its entire structure. Imagine being handed a detailed blueprint of your own emotional history and realizing that the patterns you thought were random actually have a design. You begin to recognize why certain situations produce such strong reactions in you. You may suddenly identify the moment when a particular pattern first took root. It could trace back to childhood, to a relationship, or to an event so small and seemingly insignificant that you completely forgot it ever happened. Yet today, that forgotten connection can appear with startling clarity. What makes this different from simply sitting around thinking about your problems is the quality of the understanding. This is not primarily about becoming overwhelmed by old emotions or spending hours revisiting painful memories. It is about identifying the mechanism underneath them. Mercury in Virgo approaches the problem through observation and precision. It can give you language for something you have felt but could never properly describe. It can help you understand the framework that allowed the pattern to continue, rather than leaving you with only the emotional experience of knowing that something hurts. You may finally connect the dots between the situations you repeatedly encounter and the reactions they produce inside you. You may understand why certain triggers send you into an exhausting mental spiral, while other people seem barely affected by the same circumstances. You may also recognize why one particular area of your life has remained stubbornly difficult despite all the effort you have poured into changing it. The mystery begins losing its power because you are no longer looking at isolated incidents. You are seeing the architecture underneath them. And there is a profound difference between knowing that you are hurting and understanding how the structure of that hurt operates. The first can leave you feeling powerless. The second gives you a map. You can identify where the pattern begins, how it repeats, what activates it, and what keeps it alive. Once the structure becomes visible, you are no longer wandering through the same emotional maze without knowing where the walls are. You can begin examining which pieces still belong and which pieces have been holding you in place. That is why this first revelation can feel like a turning point. You are not being asked to pretend the wound never existed. You are finally seeing it accurately enough to understand what it has been doing. But this is only the beginning, because 2 days later, the focus moves from understanding the wound to confronting an even more undeniable truth. On August 27th, At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Mercury reaches a perfect alignment with the Sun, creating what traditional astrology calls a cazimi. This is considered one of the most powerful intellectual moments of the entire year within the framework being described here. To understand why, you have to understand the unusual conditions surrounding Mercury when it moves extremely close to the Sun. Under ordinary circumstances, a planet that gets too close to the Sun can be considered combust, meaning its symbolism is weakened or overwhelmed by the immense brightness of the Sun. In the case of Mercury, this can symbolize mental uncertainty, communication difficulties, and a loss of perspective. Yet there is a very narrow exception. When Mercury enters the exact heart of the Sun, within less than 1 degree of perfect alignment, the traditional interpretation changes dramatically. Instead of being overwhelmed by the solar fire, Mercury is considered purified through it. Ancient Arabic astrologers described this condition as being in the heart of the Sun, while medieval European astrology compared it to being admitted into the presence of the king. The image is powerful because the planet is not portrayed as being destroyed by the Sun. It is portrayed as receiving special elevation through its proximity to the source of illumination. And this particular cazimi occurs in Virgo, the sign where Mercury already possesses its strongest traditional authority. Consider the symbolic combination. Mercury is operating in the sign it rules, in the sign of its exaltation, and then comes into exact contact with the illuminating power of the Sun. The result is not merely another increase in mental activity. It represents the possibility of illumination, recognition, and revelation. During the hours surrounding this exact conjunction, something you have been mentally circling for weeks or perhaps months may finally crystallize. It could concern a relationship, a professional direction, a decision you have repeatedly postponed, or a path you have been unable to determine whether you should follow. The important part is that the answer may not arrive as a collection of disconnected thoughts. It may appear as one complete realization. You could experience it almost like a sudden download, where something you've been trying to understand through countless smaller thoughts suddenly becomes obvious as a whole. For someone else, the experience may feel more confronting. It can resemble a moment of radical honesty, in which every excuse that once protected you from seeing the situation clearly suddenly loses its credibility. The justifications you created, the explanations you repeated, and the reasons you used to keep postponing a decision can begin disappearing under the symbolic fire of the Sun. What remains is much simpler and much harder to negotiate with, the truth as you actually understand it. And this is where the second revelation becomes so powerful. The answer is not necessarily ambiguous. Mercury in Virgo is associated with distinction, precision, and the separation of one thing from another. Combined with the illuminating symbolism of the Sun during cazimi, the message becomes exceptionally direct within this astrological framework. You may know what needs to happen. You may know what conversation needs to take place. You may know what needs to end and what needs to begin. You may even surprise yourself with how little hesitation remains once the realization arrives. The internal sentence that has dominated the past several weeks, "I do not know what to do," begins losing its authority. The circumstances themselves may not become easier overnight. The external situation may remain exactly as complicated as it was before. What changes is your ability to see it without distortion. You stop asking the same question because you finally understand the answer you have been avoiding. And then, almost immediately, the story moves into its most uncomfortable phase. Less than 12 hours after the cazimi, on August the 28th, a partial lunar eclipse occurs in Pisces. Within 3 hours of that eclipse, Mercury forms a tense square with Uranus, the planet traditionally associated here with sudden disruption, shock, and revolutionary change. This creates the third layer of clarity. And unlike the first revelation, which is about recognizing the wound, or the second, which is about receiving the truth, This one is about understanding what you must release. That can be far more difficult because knowing something intellectually does not automatically make you willing to let it go. The eclipse activates the Virgo-Pisces axis, bringing two very different approaches into direct tension. Virgo represents analysis, structure, control, organization, systems, and carefully constructed plans. Pisces represents flow, surrender, trust, release, and the willingness to stop trying to control every outcome. And that is where the real internal conflict begins. Because once you finally understand what is true, the next question is not whether you can see it. The next question is whether you are willing to stop holding on to what that truth tells you to release. The Sun and Mercury are now joined together in Virgo, representing everything you have just sorted through, analyzed, understood, and mapped out in your mind. You've been trying to create order from the confusion, identify the patterns, and understand every moving part, so you can finally feel secure about what comes next. But directly across from that Virgo energy, the eclipsed moon in Pisces brings forward a message that may be much harder for you to accept. You cannot control everything. You may understand the situation perfectly and still not be able to determine exactly how it unfolds. You may create the most detailed plan possible and still encounter something that was never included in your calculations. Then Uranus enters the picture, and Uranus does not deliver its message quietly. Uranus arrives as a disruption, a jolt, an unexpected development that can interrupt the structure you thought was already settled. The Mercury-Uranus square can correspond with an unexpected piece of information, a sudden change, an outcome that refuses to follow the plan you created, or someone behaving in a way that is completely different from what you expected from them. A system you depended upon may suddenly stop working the way you assumed it would. Something you believed was predictable may prove to be anything but predictable. And precisely inside that moment of disruption, the third revelation becomes visible. You suddenly recognize the part of your life you have been gripping far too tightly. Perhaps it is a plan you have been forcing, even though circumstances repeatedly showed you that it was not going to unfold exactly as imagined. Perhaps it is a relationship where you have been attempting to manage another person's choices because trusting the natural development of the connection felt too frightening. Perhaps it is the constant need to know every detail before allowing yourself to take the next step. Whatever form it takes, the realization is remarkably specific. You see where control stopped being protection and started becoming a prison. The Mercury-Uranus square does not merely interrupt your expectations. Within the symbolic language of this transit, it creates an opportunity to break free from the belief that everything must be controlled before life can move forward. True intelligence is not the ability to predict every variable. True mastery is recognizing which variables actually matter and knowing when the rest must be released. Virgo, at its highest expression, is not about creating systems so rigid that one unexpected event destroys them. It is about creating systems intelligent enough to adjust when reality changes. That distinction may become one of the most important lessons of this entire period. You may realize that the thing you were most afraid to release, whether it was a plan, a person, a belief, or an identity, was never actually protecting you in the way you thought it was. You were holding on to it because familiarity felt safer than uncertainty, but familiarity was keeping you anchored to something that no longer matched your direction. The moment you release it is therefore not proof that you failed. It is evidence that you finally recognized what was no longer working. Some of you may experience this through an unmistakable external event. Something changes suddenly and forces your hand. Others may experience the same realization almost entirely within themselves. There may be no dramatic confrontation, no announcement, and no obvious external crisis. Instead, you may simply wake up with a quiet certainty that you are finished trying to manage something that was never yours to control. The feeling may be subtle, but the knowing will not be. You may finally understand that trust is not the opposite of intelligence. Sometimes, trust is what intelligence becomes after it realizes that control has reached its limit. And this is why the deeper lesson is not perfection. The goal was never to construct a life where nothing unexpected could happen. The goal was alignment. Sometimes, alignment requires you to stop trying to redirect the river and allow yourself to move with its current. That realization becomes especially important when you step back and look at the entire 72-hour window as one connected sequence rather than three unrelated astrological events. From the 25th through the 28th of August, the story unfolds through a progression of revelation. First comes the Mercury Chiron trine, bringing the diagnosis. You begin to see the wound itself with greater precision. The vague discomfort becomes identifiable. The recurring reaction becomes understandable. The pattern that once seemed mysterious begins revealing its structure. You are no longer simply aware that something hurts. You understand where the pain connects to the way you respond to life. Then comes the Mercury Cazimi, bringing the truth. The mental fog reaches its breaking point, and the answer to the question that has been occupying your mind since the solar eclipse earlier this month can become unmistakably clear. The truth may concern a relationship, a decision, a career direction, or another question that you have repeatedly revisited without reaching a conclusion. Then comes the partial lunar eclipse and the Mercury-Uranus square, bringing the release. Once you know what is true, you can finally recognize what cannot continue. You see what needs to be loosened, what cannot be controlled, and what you have been carrying simply because you were afraid of what might happen without it. The sequence is diagnosis, truth, liberation. Each stage prepares the ground for the next. The first gives you the understanding required for the second. The second gives you the honesty required for the third. And the third gives you the freedom to act on what the first two revealed. Within this astrological framework, that progression is not presented as random or vague. It is a precise sequence occurring during the unique period in which Mercury is operating with its maximum traditional strength. That is why this particular window can feel so different from an ordinary change in mental energy. Everyone will experience the process differently, because the way these events manifest depends on the individual birth chart. For Aries ascendants, the intensity can be felt most strongly through daily routines and health. Habits that have been quietly draining their energy may become impossible to overlook. What once seemed like a normal part of life may suddenly reveal itself as something that has been exhausting them for far longer than they admitted. Gemini ascendants may feel the disruption through their home and family structures. Long-standing family patterns or ancestral dynamics may finally receive names and recognition, bringing something that has remained unspoken into conscious awareness. Leo ascendants may experience a much more confronting financial reality check, with the actual condition of their resources becoming impossible to disguise from themselves. What they have, what they do not have, and what their current financial structure can genuinely support may become far more visible. For Pisces ascendants, the partial lunar eclipse falls directly in the first house, making the experience much more personal. This is not simply about one isolated area of life. It concerns identity itself. It brings the difference between the person they have been pretending to be and the person they actually are into direct confrontation. The distance between those two versions of the self can become impossible to maintain. Yet regardless of your ascendant, this window does not leave anyone completely untouched. The form of the revelation changes, but the underlying invitation remains. Clarity arrives. The real question is whether you will accept what becomes visible or attempt to turn away from it. And turning away may become increasingly difficult, because Mercury in Virgo is associated with examining the facts, identifying the pattern, and separating reality from the story you created around it. Once you have processed the information and recognized the pattern, pretending that you do not know becomes much harder. This is why the version of you that existed before the August 12th solar eclipse cannot simply continue unchanged. That former identity has already been dissolving for weeks. You have probably felt the effects through disorientation, uncertainty, mental exhaustion, or the strange sensation that parts of your life no longer fit together the way they used to. What felt like meaningless chaos was, within this story, part of a clearing process. Old structures were being exposed because they could no longer support the person you were becoming. And today, when Mercury enters Virgo, that clearing phase begins giving way to reconstruction. But the reconstruction is not about rebuilding the old structure exactly as it was. It is about creating something different, something based on what you now know rather than what you once assumed. The new foundation is built around truth rather than speculation, precision rather than performance, and functionality rather than appearances. The confusion served a purpose because it weakened structures that were already unstable. It created enough discomfort for you to stop automatically defending what was no longer working. Now, with Mercury operating at exceptional strength, the outline of what comes next can begin appearing with unusual definition. It does not arrive merely as a vague feeling or a hopeful fantasy. It can feel like knowledge. That is why the coming hours deserve your attention. Notice what your mind keeps returning to. Notice the insights that arrive without being forced. Notice what your body has been communicating through tension and discomfort. Pay particular attention to the insights that emerge on the 27th during the Kazimi window. Within the symbolic language of this transit, these realizations are not meaningless mental noise. They represent answers to questions you have been carrying. And when the eclipse arrives on the 28th and something unexpected begins to separate from your life, do not automatically interpret the disruption as failure. Do not rush to regain control simply because the situation no longer looks the way you planned. Allow the release to happen. If something falls away during this period, it may be revealing that it was never meant to remain in its previous form. What survives the process becomes part of the foundation for the next chapter. The confusion does not continue indefinitely. Today marks the beginning of a different mental atmosphere, one in which what was previously difficult to understand can become much more precise. And once you see something with that level of clarity, you may look back and wonder how you were able to live with so much uncertainty for so long. If you have stayed with me through this entire message, thank you for giving me your time and attention. If this reading resonated with you, and you would like more content like this, consider subscribing to the channel. Your support means a great deal and helps this content reach more people who may need it. You can also share your own experiences and thoughts in the comments below, especially if you have already noticed changes in your thinking, emotions, or circumstances during this period. Take care of yourself, and I will see you in the next one.